Fokker Super Universal CF-AAM was nearing the end of an 18-year journey. Now we will take you back to the beginning to show you how this once lost artifact was brought back to life. In addition to recovering AAM's frame near Dawson City, Yukon, pilot and historian Bob Cameron collected the frames of Fokker sister ships ATJ and AJC and transported them to Whitehorse. AAM's Hamilton floats were raised from Yukon Lake, where they had been used as a barge by a local outfitter. Cameron hoped to combine the remnants into one complete airplane, but eventually decided to ship the artifacts to the Western Canada Aviation Museum in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The donation was made on the condition that, when restored, the Fokker would be completed in the livery of Northern Airways. After all, Northern Airways had operated a reliable, pioneering air service in the Yukon for 16 years, never losing a life. The RCAF, famously supportive of aviation history, secured passage on one of their Hercules aircraft. In June of 1981, Cameron arrived in Calgary, Alberta, and called up fellow pilot Clark Seaborn. Here Seaborn tells us how he came to be involved in this project.
In 1980 and 81, I'd just finished the restoration of a 1933 Waco biplane. It was a fairly classy-looking airplane and was featured in some aviation magazines. And about that time, a movie company was making an IMAX movie called Pilots North for the Edmonton Klondike Days celebration. They asked for my Waco on their movie set in March of 1981. The technical director of this movie was the famed bush pilot Stan McMillan, and he was on the set at St. Albert Airport, now defunct, for a week of filming. He delighted me with stories and photos of his start in bush flying in the late 20s. Stan's stories included many of his exploits in the Fokker Super Universal aeroplanes. About this time, Bob Cameron in Whitehorse had a similar airplane to my Waco, somewhat needing restoration, and on a trip from Whitehorse to Calgary in June of 81, he called me to see my Waco. Bob and I spent several hours at this farm strip near Calgary, tire kicking and talking about old airplanes. When Bob told me he had recovered 2 old Fokkers from the bush, which he'd given to the Western Canada Aviation Museum in Winnipeg, it caught my attention, especially after my chats with Stan McMillan, only 4 months previously. I had observed as well how well-meaning museums had collected artifact remnants of historically important airplanes and never had the money or wherewithal to make restored examples for display. Well, it bothered me. I made some foolish comment that if this museum in Winnipeg would permit a restorer/collector to sponsor a project and to ultimately fly it, that I might be interested in seeing a Fokker project in my shop. Bob took my foolish comments to the museum directors. The invitation came to me to look at their artifacts, and pending a 6-month feasibility study that followed, the rest is history.
The feasibility of a Fokker Super Universal flying again was most dependent on replicating its wooden one-piece wing, of which no complete examples existed. The search for pattern plans or blueprints ran up against similar issues. The Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. possessed no drawings. The Canadian Department of Transportation had allegedly lost their copies in a flood, and Canadian Vickers, who had built 14 Super Universals under license, had lost their drawings in a fire in 1945. Stan McMillan provided some historical photos for reference. Finally, in the fall of 1981, Seaborn got in touch with Montreal-based aviation historian and aircraft designer Ross Richardson. 30 years earlier, Richardson had hand-traced a number of 3-foot by 5-foot drawings from copies located in a Canadian archive. Richardson also suggested that Seaborn contact the FAA offices in California, and in early 1982, Seaborn traveled there and spent 4 long days examining and compiling additional valuable documentation. However, even this collection was incomplete, the records having been scrambled following an earthquake in Laguna Beach in 1972. Nevertheless, it appeared that the drawings, artifacts, and patterns, when combined, might enable this aircraft to be restored, and in July of 1982, the first shipment of aircraft components arrived at Seaborn's home in Calgary. He began with sandblasting and welding the steel tube framework. There was no original rudder amongst the artifacts, so a new one had to be fabricated from the FAA drawings. By 1983, work had begun on the fuselage itself. A new rear section was constructed out of chrome moly tubing, and rusted or damaged sections of the existing frame were carefully removed and replaced. In 1984, news emerged of the rediscovery of another Fokker Super Universal. G-CASL was discovered in the wilderness of the Northwest Territories, where it had suffered a fatal crash 52 years earlier. Mike Pirro guided Seaborn and a small group into the wreck site. Due to its remote nature, the remains of the aircraft were largely untouched. Sections of the cockpit assembly and several fittings unique to this aircraft were recovered. The wreck also provided crucial details of the cowling and control systems, details not available anywhere else. Nearly 80 pounds of steel components were packed up and crated out by hand, then flown back to Calgary. The data gathered from the SL wreck allowed for the recreation of the cockpit canopy. In 1985, the undercarriage was tackled. One original side axle and the original Bendix wheels were on hand, but very little of the original bungee assembly remained. Most of the landing gear assembly had to be fabricated from patterns. A backyard forge was built, which allowed new aluminum sand casts to be made of the sliders. New brakes built to original specs were purchased, as were tires that were designed for agricultural use, but suitably resembled the original aircraft tires. In all, over 500 hours were spent on the main undercarriage. Later that same year, Seaborn took a trip north to visit his friend Bob Cameron, where he met AAM's final owner, George Simmons.
We had a very nice visit with George Simmons on the occasion when Clark Seaborn came up here to see the country, and we went out and scrounged a few more parts and visited some crash sites and things, and we also visited George Simmons. And George normally was not given to talking about the old days, particularly with strangers, but by way of introducing Clark as the man who is restoring George's first airplane to flying condition. And not only that, Clark, being the diplomat that he is, brought and presented to George a model of that Fokker. And all of these things made George very happy. He was so pleased to see that we were restoring his first airplane, his Fokker Super Universal. And in fact, one of the things he asked me when we were leaving and Clark was out of earshot, he asked me, he says, I wonder if Clark will want me to check him out on the Fokker. So I mentioned that to Clark later. We thought what a wonderful thing it would be if we could have the Fokker flying in time for George Simmons to fly in it again.
Simmons passed away shortly afterwards, never having had the opportunity to see AAM fly one last time. In 1986, Seaborn knew what he had to do next. AAM needed wings.